Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Goulder, contributing editor with Tax Notes. If you follow current developments in the world of international tax, and you probably already know about the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals. These are very ambitious reforms that seek to fundamentally alter how governments all over the world would be taxing corporate income. Pillar 1, just very briefly, it's a revised nexus standard with a sort of unconventional profit allocation rule. Pillar 2 envisions a global minimum tax that's aimed at stopping the so-called race to the bottom. Now, over the course of many months, our print and online publications have been raising issues related to these two proposals. And one of the better pieces that we've published was authored by today's guest, Mindy Herzfeld, who's joining us. She's a professor of tax practice at the University of Florida Law School and counsel with the Potomac Law Group. She's also a frequent contributor to Tax Notes International, so our regular readers will be very familiar with her writing. Today, we're profiling the article she wrote that was published in Tax Notes International on July 19th. It's titled Pushing Pillar 1 Past Congress, and it raises some perplexing questions about how the Biden administration and the Treasury Department intend to get these pillars implemented, particularly Pillar 1. So, Mindy, thank you for joining us and welcome to In the Pages.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right to it. Your article points out how Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, they really face different paths going forward. Supposedly, we keep hearing that Pillar 2 is going to be included in this big reconciliation bill that we can expect later this year. Why doesn't that same legislative approach work for Pillar 1?
Yeah, there's I think two related reasons why most people think that Pillar 1 needs to be implemented by a treaty, and in fact, the OECD has said they will begin next year working on such a multilateral treaty. The first is because Pillar 1, unlike Pillar 2, really is an override or would change the way a non-resident is taxed in a country, in a jurisdiction in which it's doing business. So those rules for when a non-resident has a taxable presence in a jurisdiction are laid out in treaties. That's the permanent establishment rule. And the way profits are allocated to a non-resident's permanent establishment is also has specific rules under a treaty, which means that because Pillar 1 would be revising those rules, you could really only do that through a similar kind of instrument, through a treaty that's negotiated or agreed to by more than one country. So that's the first point, that the rules being proposed by Pillar 1 would override the existing treaties. And of course, the United States has about 60 bilateral treaties that would need to be amended if the United States decided to agree to change its rules like this. The second reason why Pillar 1 would need this kind of multilateral treaty and not just amendments to bilateral treaty is that the mechanism it envisions for how these rules would be changed and how profits would be allocated or reallocated, differently allocated than under existing law, is a kind of multilateral. It's not a bilateral process. It requires countries to agree on what any given company, those companies that would be subject to these rules, it takes their global profits and then says, you get this much, you get that much, and based on how much sales there are in that jurisdiction. But what that process also requires is that countries that are today allocated those profits under existing laws agree to give up those profits. So it really requires for each company that is subject to this reallocation, as the rules envision, to go through a process where countries sit down and hash it out. And you can't do that either under purely domestic law or even a bilateral treaty. You really need some kind of multilateral mechanism to do that. Long answer to your question of why Pillar 1 really envisions a very different, or requires a very different path through Congress than the Pillar 2, which can be done just through domestic legislation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Pillar 2, really, any country, anywhere, can just have at it anytime they want. They don't need to wait for the OECD. They don't need to wait for anyone. I mean, you can make the case that the United States is already halfway there, or maybe more than halfway there with Pillar 2, because we have something that looks like an income inclusion rule and something that looks like a undertax payment rule. So countries can do that anytime, but it sort of takes a treaty to change all these treaties. Now, people are going to start to wonder what's going to be left of the arm's length principle after Pillar 1 happens. And maybe the full breadth of that is a conversation for another day. But your paper makes the observation that there's a certain awkwardness in having two rival competing concepts for how to divide up profits, because this is not just a full movement to some kind of sales factor apportionment. You still have the arm's length method some of the times, and then you still have this Pillar 1 formulary apportionment some of the times. Isn't that going to be awkward? And what does that say about the durability of the arm's length principle going forward?
Yeah, so as you are well aware, Bob, the OECD has for years been insisting that this current project, which had its origin in the BEPS project, which started about 2013, is not supposed to rewrite the arm's length standard of transfer pricing rules, and is not adopting a formulary apportionment principle. Formulary apportionment being you take global profits, you take a company's global profits, and you allocate it according to a formula among different countries. And so the OECD has repeatedly said that that's not what it's doing. But in a recent talk, one of the senior OECD official acknowledged that that's essentially what this Pillar 1 approach does. It essentially adopts a kind of formulary apportionment approach to allocating some companies' global profits. Now, it's not all of those profits, it's profits in excess of a specified margin, and only a portion of those profits. But if this approach is successful, if this it's kind of an experiment for a limited number of companies and a limited amount of their profits, if it's actually workable, you have to assume that there would be a broad appetite for extending that approach to a much larger set of companies, and not just limited to 20% of companies' profits, but to the whole bucket. So that's one way this could play out. The approach is that the Pillar 1 rules are much more successful than anyone currently imagines, and so we extend it fully. But the other way this could play out, which I think is probably more likely, is that it's either it hits stumbling blocks on implementation, or it's not. It's more challenging to implement these proposed rules than one might imagine. Although it seems pretty challenging, you can imagine that it's pretty challenging. But so I don't think this train stops. Then what happens at that point is, the door has been opened to this idea of formulary apportionment, and rather than saying, oh, this idea, this Pillar 1 idea, kind of put in print in 2021, this didn't work out, so let's just scrap the whole idea altogether. No, the more likely scenario, I think, is that people say, well, it didn't work out exactly as proposed at that point in time, but let's take that. If we tweak it here and make changes here, then perhaps we can make this work. And so I think the fact that there's a proposal for some kind of formulary apportionment today, even though a limited one, makes it more likely that we see kind of a broader erosion of arm's length standard transfer pricing in the future.
You mentioned that the work on the multilateral instrument probably isn't going to start until next year, 2022. So that's fine in terms of the timeline, but this will not be the first multilateral instrument. There was a previous MLI, as it's known, that the United States didn't sign. That was the one relating to the original BEPS project. The vast majority of countries involved in that signed the MLI, which had the effect of modifying their treaty networks. The United States sat that one out. What do you think is going to happen this time? If there's an MLI version 2, does the United States sign it?
Yeah, I think it's a different kind of scenario between the MLI from the BEPS project and the way the current project is going. And in the BEPS project, the United States Treasury took the position that the United States didn't need to sign the MLI. The MLI had some of the BEPS minimum standards in it, and so countries that didn't, say, have an anti-abuse rule in their treaties would be required to sign up to that principle as part of the minimum standards. The United States said, well, we've had for decades an anti-abuse rule in our treaties. We don't have a principal purpose test, which is the primary test being adopted by most other countries, but we do have the limitation on benefits article, and that's a perfectly adequate anti-abuse rule, and the OECD blessed it in the BEPS project, and some of the other changes we don't agree with, and we said so as part of the BEPS project, and so we both don't need to, and we're opposed. We don't need to sign it to be on board with the changes being proposed, and some of them we fundamentally disagree with. So the Treasury never advanced. The U.S. Treasury was never behind the MLI as an instrument that should go through Congress. The multilateral convention that would be drafted and proposed to implement Pillar 1, I think the administration, I mean, obviously it's not drafted yet, but it's something that the current administration is fully behind. And so the challenge for them is not, well, how do we make it clear? How do we make our position clear that we don't need to sign this, but how are we going to get this agreement through Congress? So it's a much different challenge. And the challenge there is not on the Treasury side as much as on the congressional side.
Speaking of that, one of the things I really liked about your article was how you both summarized and critiqued this constitutional argument, something that I view as a novel argument about what's required to get a tax treaty ratified. The conventional wisdom is that the House of Representatives is just left out of the process, that this happens in the Senate. A treaty or a amending protocol starts through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then it moves on and has to get a vote before the full Senate. But this novel theory out there that you detail in your paper, not your theory, by the way, but one that you shed a lot of light on, it implies that there's going to be a role for the House of Representatives. Now, this is going to leave a lot of people scratching their heads. Can you tell us what is this alternate scenario for treaty ratification that involves the House, and where does it come from?
Yeah, so Bob, I think for most tax people, this analysis kind of begins and ends with an article written by Rebecca Kaiser, who's currently a senior official in the Treasury Department, wrote in 2013 on the constitutionality of tax treaties. But I think it's helpful to take a step back for a minute and see where Kaiser's article came from, and that's really kind of from an international law perspective, and it builds on an article written by Una Hathaway, who's not a tax person, but an international law professor. And Hathaway did a lot of work building a database of US treaties and what are called congressional executive agreements, because they're adopted not through the formal constitutional treaty process, but through a more typical legislative process. And what Hathaway argues is that what she shows by really compiling this very extensive database is that we there's not really any coherence in the US approach to when we say something is a formal treaty and needs to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate, which is required under the Constitution for treaties, and when something can be implemented through what's called a congressional executive agreement, which just needs a majority vote in the House and the Senate. And so Hathaway her article is called Treaties End, and what she tries to argue from this kind of random and unprincipled approach to when Congress or the executive follows a formal treaty approach rather than a congressional executive approach is that we really shouldn't be we should just discard this whole treaty process. It doesn't make sense. And then she develops some constitutional historical arguments for why to support that argument, and also argues that really the only reason that we still have this treaty ratification process she traces back to opposition to human rights agreements in the 60s and the concern among Southern legislators that these agreements would be used to against the Jim Crow laws in the South and segregation laws. And so she said, well, that clearly is not a reason to continue to follow treaties. She also develops arguments from the fact that our trade agreements mostly now follow this path of being enacted through a simple majority vote. And so she says, well, we do it in trade, and in trade, you could argue that's the best reason. So if you go back, she goes back to the constitutional history and says, well, the reason for a 2/3 vote requirement is to protect regional interests. But we've largely discarded this principle in the case of trade agreements, which arguably have more potential impact on regional interests than any other kind of international agreement. And so we've discarded it for trade agreements, and then perhaps we should think seriously about discarding it altogether. Okay, so those are Hathaway's arguments. Kaiser then takes those arguments and extends them specifically to tax treaties, which in Hathaway's database are one of the very few kinds of agreements that are international agreements that are only enacted through or only agreed to by this 2/3 treaty ratification process. And she says, well, even more than all other types of agreements, all other types of international agreements, a tax treaty has much better rationale for having it be enacted through a majority vote that starts in the House, because a tax treaty is revenue legislation. And we all know through the origination clause that revenue measures have to start in the House. And so not only are Hathaway's arguments as to the incoherence of our treaty versus congressional executive agreement policy, not only are those valid in the tax treaty context, they're even more, they're even stronger. And not just that, but perhaps we've been doing it wrong for the past 100 years. And so she kind of lifts off of Hathaway's arguments and then builds on them. Just to note one other point that they both make, Kaiser makes, but also I think building on Hathaway's points, that the treaty ratification process makes it hard for the US to live up to its international commitments because of the uncertainty surrounding whether any agreement the executive makes will ever be ratified by a 2/3 vote. The US loses standing in the international.
That is fascinating. One thing comes to mind, though, and you do mention this in your article. There's this concept that we're all familiar with, that revenue measures originate in the House. What about a little pushback that is a tax treaty really a revenue measure if the primary purpose of a tax treaty is to lower withholding rates? Then you're actually, the government's collecting less revenue by having the withholding taxes reduced under the treaty. Is there a way there to say, well, this isn't one of those revenue measures? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Kaiser acknowledges that point and then dismisses it by saying we don't apply this principle so firmly. We we don't look at a bill to say, oh, how much is it going to raise, or is it possibly going to lose, and then say, oh, because it might lose money instead of raising, then we won't. Then we'll say it doesn't have to start in the House. So she dismisses it. I don't feel that. I think the much bigger hurdle, I think two bigger hurdles for the argument she makes are one, that it's not necessarily clear that even if you say the origination clause trumps the treaty ratification requirement in the case of tax treaties, it doesn't necessarily mean that we discard the treaty ratification clause. So you could say, oh, Kaiser's arguments are all valid, and we should perhaps consider a tax treaty of revenue measure that we should start in the House. But because it's also a treaty, because it's also an international agreement, we should also follow the treaty ratification process. So just because we think it's a revenue measure doesn't mean we discard the treaty ratification requirement. So I think that's one argument against her conclusion. And the other, I think, is that you have to acknowledge the validity of 100 years of precedence in this area, and really consider strongly the problems that could be associated with just abandoning it, and especially abandoning it in a context like this very complex OECD agreement.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you could actually agree with the points that they're making, but come to the opposite conclusion for the reasons that you just mentioned. So you mentioned with the treaty clause of the Constitution and this idea that it's there as a sort of limit, a constraint on the federal government's ability to barter away or negotiate away through treaties and international agreements regional interests. Does that apply to taxing the digital economy or the types of changes we're thinking about with Pillar One? Is there a regional aspect to who the domestic winners and losers are going to be with Pillar One?
Yeah, I think, Bob, it's hard to say at this point because we haven't seen the list of companies who are going to end up being subject to this. But it seems pretty clear that it's mostly digital companies, but also, I think, unexpectedly to most people, manufacturing companies. So there's those two broad groups. And then there's two groups of very large, often very large and very profitable companies that are not part of this, are specifically carved out of this agreement. And that's financial services and oil and gas. And those, if we take just those four kind of industry groups, they have clear regional distinction. Financial services, Northeast, tech, West Coast, oil and gas, Southwest, manufacturing, Midwest. And so, again, no one's seen any numbers for right now. Most of the conversation has been which countries are winners or losers under this agreement. But once you get to looking at within a country, there will obviously be companies that are winners and losers. And so I think even though it's hard to talk about, there even begin to think about regional interests within the context of such a broad global agreement, it seems pretty clear that it would have more impact on some regions and less on others. And I don't, again, it's hard to translate that back to the kind of regional interests that when we think about kind of 18th century or 19th century history and North manufacturing and South cotton and tobacco. But the point that going back to one of Hathaway's points that, oh, we've been doing this for trade agreements and so we should just follow along with it. I think, when I look at how the history of trade agreements has played out for this country's internal politics, it's not that clear that we should have been, that perhaps ignoring regional interests is the right way to go, or was the right way to go, or that we should be continuing down that route. And so maybe give the founders some credit for that 2/3 vote to protect interests of the minority, for ensuring the continued health and strength of our democracy.
Okay, now I have to ask you my Rand Paul question here. Some of us will recall that a single U.S. senator, Rand Paul from the state of Kentucky, blocked ratification of U.S. treaties and protocols for a large number of years. Basically, those instruments were all frozen at the committee level. One of the first things I thought when I read the paper is like, hey, they're worried about this happening again, whether it happens to be frozen by Rand Paul or some other senator. They're worried about that repeating itself, and they don't want that outcome. And that's the whole reason why they're thinking about this, to try to grease the wheels. Do you think that's in their minds at all?
I think the challenges that this agreement would face in Congress are much broader than just one senator being a holdout. I think that you'd have a very hard time getting any Republican votes, or more than a handful possibly. And so I don't think it's, oh, we're concerned about one senator. I think it's how do we get this through the current composition of the Senate, and not just the current composition, but looking forward, recognizing that there will, for the foreseeable future, be a large number of Republican senators who are more likely to oppose a kind of global agreement like this that looks like it cedes some U.S. taxing rights for the interests of international cooperation.
So let's talk about the vote counts. 2/3, a supermajority. That's 67 senators, correct? And it's currently split 50-50. So for this to happen, 17 Republicans would have to go along with it. And as you hinted in your response to the last question, it's kind of doubtful that they would get more than just a handful. So that brings me to my final question, Mindy, the filibuster. What is the interrelation here between possibly eliminating the Senate filibuster and then that changing the dynamics of this conversation?
Yeah, so even if you give full credence to Kaiser's arguments and say, okay, we're going to scrap 100 years of precedents, and we think that there's a good case to be made for this multilateral treaty being enacted, being implemented through a normal legislative process that only requires 50 votes, you still get stuck in the Senate on the possibility of a filibuster. Now, as we sit here today, the Democrats are planning to push through a major spending and tax raising bill through this reconciliation process that allows a measure to go through with only 50 plus one votes. But it's really unclear, and more than unclear, I think, questionable about whether that reconciliation process could be used for something like an international agreement.
Well, there you have it. It is good reading. The name of the article is Pushing Pillar 1 Past Congress. It will be time well spent as you ponder what's going to happen with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And we're really going to spend the whole rest of the year sitting on the edge of our seats, waiting to see how all of this plays out. As we do that, there'll be more coverage in our publications. Mindy Herzfeld, thank you for joining us. Hope to talk to you again when we're on the other side and we can look back and see how all of this played out.
Thanks, Bob.
Want more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers, Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, and showrunner and video editor, Jordan Parrish.